So in chapter 6, Locke finishes out his list, his description of, so almost finishes out his description of things that exist outside of civil society and in the state of nature. And the last big one is the power of parents. And he's very careful. I mean, Locke is not, don't get your hopes up. He's not a feminist. But at the same time, he understands that, or actually what he's trying to do is diminish the idea that there's something mystical and magical and sacred about fatherhood. And so it's interesting to watch as we go through there exactly what he, or as we go through this, what exactly he does with all of that. So the problem, of course, and the reason he's attacking the power of fathers in particular, is that Filmer has written this book, Patriarcha, right, which is all about fatherhood and sort of gives a kind of entitlement to fatherhood that Locke thinks is totally misplaced. So why? Well, he tells us in the first paragraph, right? I mean, for whatever obligation nature and the right of generation lays on children, it must certainly bind them equally to both concurrent causes of it. Fathers and mothers both have kind of an equal share, and if anything, mothers have a greater share because they've got the pains of childbirth and things like that. So, that's why Locke is attacking sort of paternal authority. But the other thing that he's doing, right, and recall that this is all about civil society, right, about natural society. This is society in the state of nature, outside of any direction, control, advice, whatever government might have. So Locke is trying to, spoiler alert, where we're going with this is limited government, right? There are certain things that are just off limits for government because that has nothing to do with why government exists. The family is one, property is one, right? So as you look at the list of things that Locke is coming up with, marriage, it turns out, is sort of ambiguous. So watch what he's doing here and sort of think about, put it in the big picture, big context. Okay, so human beings are by nature equal. Well, that means, of course, that God or nature doesn't give fathers any more authority over children than it gives anybody else. Which is to say, nature gives no one authority over children or over you or over me or anything else. So top 726, right? All this consists with the equality that all men are, which all men are in respect of jurisdiction or dominion over one another. Nobody is born to rule, right? Jefferson said one time, there are not people who are born with saddles. Sorry, I'll tell you the metaphor later. We'll discuss it in class. Maybe I'll get it right later. But children are not born equal, right? As he says later on. Okay. Anyway, at the beginning of section 55, children I confess, are not born in this state of equality, though they are born to it, right? So children are not born equal. Children are helpless when they're first born. Children need to be educated. Children need to become rational in the same way that they need to learn to walk. So what then is the role of parents? Well, for Locke, it's primarily this educative function, right? He says in 56, to supply the defects of this imperfect state till the improvement of growth and age has removed them. Adam and Eve and after them, all parents were, by the law of nature, under an obligation to preserve, nourish, and educate the children they had begotten. So when you take on being a parent, you have an obligation to your children. That's not an obligation that the law gave you. That's not an obligation that exists by consent, for example. I mean, the children didn't consent to be born, right? You have to take care of them. And that's the point. So, children, he says, were produced ignorant and without the use of reason, were not presently under that law. So they can understand, they have the reason to understand the natural law, but they have to be educated a little bit in order to arrive at that understanding. And this is, Locke introduces in 57 a concept that is fundamental to our thoughts about what law might be, right? He says, for nobody can be under a law which is not promulgated to him. Promulgation means it's made public, right? It is knowable, even if it is not known. So ignorance of the law is not an excuse. So you can't say, well, I didn't know that that was the law, right? But it has to be knowable. You have to be able to find it. And it should be, ideally, a law that is not only findable, but understandable by you and me, by lay people. And so you don't have to be a sophisticated lawyer in order to understand it. This law being promulgated or made known by reason only, he that is not come to the use of reason cannot be said to be under this law, right? So until children achieve the age of reason, which is about 35, they cannot be understood to be under the natural law. Law, see, Locke says. I mean, and this is different, right? So Locke gives us a substantive understanding of what law is. Very top of the second column on 726, for law in its true notion is not so much the limitation as the direction of a free and intelligent agent to his proper interest, and prescribes no farther than is for the general good of those under that law. So he puts some important conditions on what law is. It has to be known, promulgated, right? It is the direction of a free and intelligent agent, and it's for their good. So this really qualifies what it is. Law is not just arbitrary, right? Law is not simply the will of the sovereign, which is what it had been for Hobbes. Law is something that keeps us from killing each other, pure and simple, and the rest of it is gravy. For Locke, law has everything to do with preserving freedom, with keeping our natural abilities, our natural powers, as we'll see in chapter 9, our property, for us, and allowing other things to change around us. The end of law, he goes on to say, this is a little bit further down in that paragraph, the end of law is not to abolish or restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. And again, for Locke, freedom is about using your natural powers in natural ways, in appropriate ways, okay? So the power that parents have is a natural power. Locke totally concedes that, right? It's something that they take on naturally. Nature gives it to them, or God. It's up to you. But it doesn't, it's not affected by the role of the state until some later stage, right? Does that make sense? So if you're looking for a natural origin of government, right? I mean, this is where Locke is going. If you're looking for a natural origin of government, this is a logical one, right? Because parents do have a power of governing their children. But what is the purpose of the power, right? Well, the purpose of the power that parents have is a purpose to improve their kids, right? And it's for their good. So that would, if that translated into power of government, that would certainly imply certain things about what government is and what it does. But Locke says that doesn't apply. That's not where government power comes from, okay? So government and nature are just opposite things. So 58, he kind of sums up the power then that parents have over their children arises from that duty which is incumbent on them to take care of their offspring during the imperfect state of childhood. Now, so Locke goes on to talk about maturity. I mean, you guys can understand that part. You guys can understand it all. You don't really need me, but that's a different problem. I'm getting paid to be here. I have tenure. What the hell? A capacity of knowing the law, right? So growing your children to maturity is important. Now, sometimes people are defective. Think back to Aristotle's talk about natural slaves, right? And what they were capable of, and so on. So these are the people that Locke is thinking about, right? People who are never capable of becoming a free man because they have to have someone else regulate them. And I don't think, I mean, Locke doesn't go where Aristotle goes, right? Locke doesn't say, oh yes, these are slaves by nature. But he does say they're not capable of self-government. And so then a question of, what kind of consent is able to be derived from these people. That's an interesting problem, and people have tried to deal with that. So 61, he kind of sums it up again, right? Thus we are born free as we are born rational. So not that we have actually the exercise of either. Age that brings one brings with it the other two, right? So freedom and rationality go together. But freedom and rationality are not things that we naturally have as we're in our infancy, right? They're things that we have to acquire. And they're things that our parents have to help us acquire. Okay, like I say, if there are questions, comments, please ask in the forum. Yeah, so freedom is grounded in reason, right? The power of the magistrate, then, this is on 728 and 65. And Locke says, he's talking about mothers, right? And mothers and their authority, and magistrates, right? Right. So look in the second column, right? And will anyone say the mother has legitimate power, blah, blah, blah. Can they, as he says, bind the liberty of their children in all the course of their lives, right? Or can she enforce the observation of them with capital punishments, right? He's asking about maternal power. And Locke says, for this is the proper power of the magistrate, of which the father has not so much as the shadow. So neither fathers nor mothers have the power of life and death over their kids. His command, and by extension the mother's command as well, his command over his children is but temporary and reaches not their life or property. So parental power is a power to take care of, to nurture someone to the condition of reason, but isn't a power over life or property um, the natural powers that you have, right? Um, and so he goes on to say, right, what about kings, right? What do they have to be nice to their mother? And um, at the end of 67, right, the 66 rather, 729, the honor due to parents, a monarch in his throne owes to his mother, and yet this lessens not his authority, nor subjects him to her government. Right? So he's thinking very carefully about this stuff, and he's parsing out the different kinds of authority in ways that we haven't actually seen before. You remember Aristotle talks about the difference between a head of household and a state. And that distinction is a little bit murky in Aristotle. It's still a little murky here. But we see that Locke is clearly separating the power of a magistrate and the power of a parent. Now, what is the honor due from a child? Well, depends on how much money your parents are spending on you, it turns out, right? So the honor due from a child places in the parents a perpetual right to respect, reverence, support, and compliance to, remember that, you're living at home now, so, be nice to your parents. More or less as the father's care, cost, and kindness in his education have been more or less. So the more your parents spend on you, the more respect, reverence, support, and compliance you owe them. So you have it on Locke's authority there. Okay, so and where does this come from? Well, where is it? Well, we later we find out that you can bestow your estate on whoever you like, and that's an important tie to filial obedience from your children. Okay, so we can talk about honor and so forth. You can ask questions about that, right? So. Oh, there it is. Okay, in 72, right? Page 730, second column, towards the top of the column. There is another tie. Another power ordinary in the father, whereby he has a tie on the obedience of his children, which, though it be common to him with other men, blah, 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 and this is the power men generally have to bestow their estates on those who please them best. So not only do you have obligations to your parents, depending on the amount they spend on you, but it's probably in your self-interest to be the one that pleases your parents best so that they can bestow their estates on you. Think about that. Okay, so what is the nature of your subjection through your parents to government, right? How does that chain work? Locke starts to tackle this in 73. I'm not ultimately sure that he tackles it well, although I think he tackles it better than Hobbes. I will say that. Does your authority, does your obedience to the government of the United States owe because your parents are citizens of the United States? Or is it something that do you have a direct relationship with the government of the United States in ways that your parents are not part of, you see? And this is an important question because if government actually exists by consent, where does your consent come in? Is it implicit, right? In your upbringing? Is it implicit in everything you've done? Or is it something that you actually give on your 21st birthday when you are able to drink? I mean, on your 18th when you're able to vote, and so forth. So, and Locke answers this in section 73, right? For every man's children, being by nature as free of himself, as himself or any of his ancestors ever were, may, whilst they were in that freedom, choose what society they will join themselves to, what commonwealth they will put themselves under. So people have an inherent right, a natural right, to migrate, right? This is a necessary inference from the fact that human beings are naturally free. So how you use your freedom, right, is your choice. No obedience to a government qualifies that choice. So again, this goes back to that very beginning, right, when Locke says the natural state is the state all men are naturally in, right? And that is a state of perfect freedom. So your parentage, your status as a child, your status as a child of citizens of the United States, your residence in the United States, Locke says none of that makes any difference. You still have the right to go somewhere else and to declare your consent, your obedience to that government. And you're free to choose. You are free to choose. And so he goes, he talks about that then in the rest of that chapter. And then he talks about sort of why we see so many monarchies, right? Why does it seem like monarchy is somehow a natural form of government? And the answer is this, again, it goes back to this is the way we've always done it, right? 75, right? Thus it was easy and almost natural for children by a tacit and scarce avoidable consent to make way for the father's authority in government. If you've lived with your parent and you grow up with your parent and you establish a household for yourself, your deference to parental authority is going to continue, right? And so it's perfectly normal, not necessarily natural. That's an important distinction, but it's normal for you to think, okay, well, this is the way I've lived, this is the way I've gone, and this is how I'm going to continue to go. And so at bottom of 731, beginning of section 76, thus the natural fathers of families by an insensible change became the politic monarchs of them too. So we didn't really perceive it as it was happening, right? So it's natural in the sense that this is the way things have tended to go, if that makes sense. All right. So again, this concludes Locke's discussion of the human natural powers in the state of nature. He hasn't yet developed why the state of nature is problematic or inadequate. But you can start to see that property needs to be regulated, right? The family needs to be regulated in some way, because otherwise there are disputes, right? And you need, as he says, a known and indifferent judge to make sense of these disputes. So this brings us to civil society, and this is going to, as you read this, bear in mind that what Locke suggests positively is stuff that is absent in the state of nature. So his critique of the state of nature is implicit in chapter 7, but he doesn't make it explicit there. So And he begins in a very interesting way, right? God, having made man such a creature that in his own judgment it was not good for him to be alone, put him under strong obligations of necessity, convenience, and inclination to drive him into society, as well as fitted him with understanding and language to continue and enjoy it. Aristotle, Plato, and Cicero had summed it up, right? That human beings are both rational and social animals. And this is what Locke is referring to there. So there's no disagreement necessarily between Locke and the classics on human nature and sort of how humans deal with their with their natural sociability, rationality. What's interesting there is that God has created man. God gave man judgment in order to decide, hey, this is not good for me. I need a different situation, right? I need to exercise my sociality, my sociability. I need to exercise my rationality, right? And to do that, I need other people. I need other people to talk to. I need other people to interact with, and so on. The first society, Locke says, and we'll get to conjugal society here in the next chapter, or in chapter 9. So Locke says the first society, well, we will get to conjugal society eventually. I thought there was a whole chapter on it. Anyway, the first society was between man and wife, which gave beginning to that between parents and children. So the first society that humans form is two people who marry. Probably not marriage in the original sense, but there we are. And it starts, as he says in 78, it starts by a voluntary compact. So marriage is not something that parents, conspire to or collude to arrange a marriage between a man and a woman. It is between two individuals. There is nothing, by the way, in Locke that suggests that two persons of the same sex could not have something like a conjugal society. But the end of conjugal society is procreation, right? So because that purpose limits it, you'd probably have to call an arrangement between two persons of the same sex something different. But it doesn't mean that they can't consent to it. It doesn't mean that it's illegitimate somehow to have it. And he points this out in 79. For the end of the conjunction between male and female, conjunction, that's a good word for it, between male and female being not barely procreation, but the continuation of the species, right? So this conjunction ought to last even after procreation, right? So human beings are complex creatures. They're born helpless. They're born non-rational. And they have to develop that. They have to learn to walk. They have to learn to be rational. They have to learn to feed themselves, right? Think for themselves, all of that stuff. And conjugal society is designed to help them do that. And it takes us longer than other creatures. Like I say, you are going to be fully, your cortex, whatever the hell it is, the post cerebral cortex or what have you, hypothalamus. It takes a long time to develop, right? And it develops more slowly in men than in women. Sorry, guys. And so, you have a lot of guys at the age of of 17 or 20, right? Whose last words are, watch this. Women, not so much. So the responsibility to supervise humans as they grow up is not an easy one. And this is part of what conjugal society is designed to do. Again, it's a human arrangement that helps to repair some of the defects of nature. So, top of 733, interesting claim here, right? Society of man, they made it necessary that society of man and wife should be more lasting than of male and female amongst other creatures, that so their industry might be encouraged and their interest better united, to make provision and lay up goods for their common issue, which uncertain mixture or easy and frequent solutions of conjugal society would mightily disturb. In other words, the stability of the conjugal relationship is something that Locke thinks is important, among other things, for the preservation of property, right? So acquisition, property, these are part of the household, as Aristotle had said, again. But Locke is developing this. And again, for Locke, this is before there is the state, before there is civil society. Okay. So 733, section 82, just to note in the middle of that paragraph, the power of the husband being so far from that of an absolute monarch that the wife has in many cases a liberty to separate from him, where a natural right or their contract allows it. So for Locke, again, marriage is not limited to the sort of church definitions of what marriage is, or marriage as perpetual, or any of that stuff. The husband and wife may separate. If the husband is abusive or in any other way, or if the wife is a gambler or whatever, right? They can go their separate ways. So the authority of the husband is not absolute over the wife. And for Locke, right, this is a principle of government that goes throughout his theory, right? Government is limited. Government is not absolute. Government doesn't have the power to take people's liberties or lives arbitrarily and hang on to it, right? To the extent that government qualifies your liberty, it's got to be limited, and it's got to be temporary. So, on 85, and again, notice how Aristotle is kind of channeling, Locke is kind of channeling Aristotle in book 1 of the Politics here, right? Because he then moves to servants and slaves. And a slave, he says, is a captive taken in a just war. So for Locke, this notion of natural slaves, which Aristotle had, that's not part of his definition of how slavery works, right? Slavery is simply the continuation of the state of war in that relationship. And this, by the way, Jefferson and all of the American founders understood this quite well, that slavery was not naturally just or naturally beneficent in some way. That slavery was actually unjust. It was an assertion of power over the slave that um, it lasted as long as the slave had unequal power. And they didn't think that slaves, well, you understand. They didn't think that slaves had they knew that slaves had natural rights. They knew that they held their slaves simply by force. And they knew that that was unjust, partly because they had read Locke. All right. And then on 734, section 87, Locke finally takes us to this idea of where political society begins, right? There and there only, he says, is political society, where every one of the members hath quitted his natural power, resigned it up into the hands of the community in all cases, that excludes him not from appealing for protection to the law established by it. So political society is where when we give up our natural powers, and Locke will give some important qualifications on this, right? For Hobbes, you give up all of your natural power, all of your executive power of the law of nature and everything else. For Locke, it's a little more qualified. But the idea of standing rules, right, promulgated rules that exist in the same way for everybody. You don't get your own rule in Lockean society, right? And so the disputes that happen among the people in the society are disputes that are handled by in different in standard ways, right? In uniform ways. So the idea of a level playing field, and again, this goes into our idea of what a rule of law looks like. He sums this up in section 88, right? Herein we have the original of the legislative and executive power of civil society, which is to judge by standing laws how far offenses are to be punished when committed within the Commonwealth, and so forth. So the intent of this treatise for Locke is to give us a sense of sort of how good laws might work, and how good laws, or what are the criteria by which we judge whether a law is good or not. Section 90, he gets to the heart of his disagreement with Filmer. And this is sort of where he's been going ever since he started on this notion of paternal power, right? Hence, it is evident that absolute monarchy, which by some men is counted the only government in the world, is indeed inconsistent with civil society, and so can be no form of civil government at all. Absolute government is illegitimate, right? It's inherently, everywhere, always illegitimate. It is no form of civil government at all, because it rests on force, and it only rests on force. And then look what he says at the bottom of the first column, top of the second, on 735, right? So that such a man, however entitled, czar or grand seigneur, or however you please, or how you please, is as much in the state of nature with all under his dominion as he is with the rest of mankind. So an absolute monarch is not just illegitimate, unjust, but exists in a force relationship with his subjects that is illegitimate, problematic, subject to be overturned at any time. And yeah, so The problem is, as Locke brings it up in section 93, right? What security, what fence is there in such a state against the violence and oppression of this absolute ruler? The question can scarce be borne. There is no fence, there is no barrier to the absolute oppression of an absolute monarch. So yeah, at the end of chapter 7 then, right? No man in civil society can be exempted from the laws of it. So you have to be subject to the law. And those who are subject to the law must have a hand in making the law as well. That's the other thing, right? Those who make the law need to be subject to it. So chapter 8, the beginning of political societies. So human beings are by nature free, equal, and independent. Nobody can be put out of this estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. The only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty is by agreeing with others to join into the community. So the social contract is foundational for civil society, and it has to be voluntary. You cannot be coerced into consenting. Now, what's interesting is that there's two aspects to this. And in section 96, he starts to talk about democracy and how, so you have to have unanimous consent in order to found a political society. But how do you decide where it goes, what its laws are, what its motion is? And he says, top of the second column in 737, right? It is necessary the body should move that way whither the greater force carries it, which is by consent of the majority. Or else it is impossible it should act or continue one body, blah, 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 right? So you have to have unanimous consent in order to found government. But it only takes the will of the majority to move government in some way. Why is that? Well, unanimous consent is a wonderful idea, right? Seems to be necessary in order to impose people, impose the law on people. But unanimous consent is virtually impossible to attain on a continuing basis, on an ongoing basis. Either somebody is sick, right, or has business in Poland and can't be there to consent, or you got one dissenter who holds everything up, right? And so in practice, insisting on unanimous consent is an insistence on minority rule. And that, Locke says, is unjust. So if you are committed to rule of the majority, it has to be a majority. It has to be more than half, as Dr. Plain will say, and he's much better on telling you what exactly a majority is, right? It's not 50% plus one, he will tell you. So section 98, Locke kind of sums this up, right? For if the consent of the majority shall not in reason be conceived as the act of the whole and conclude every individual, nothing but the consent of every individual can make anything the act of the whole, right? So it would be unjust, we think it's unjust, right, for minorities to rule. And insisting on unanimous consent would in effect put a minority in the driver's seat. (101) Locke says, well, where can we find a state of nature in society? And he gives pretty much the same answer that Hobbes gives, right? He goes on, he talks a little bit about, how government existed before records, which is all, all true. But most importantly, right, um, the state of nature exists between an absolute monarch and subjects, or between sovereigns in the international sphere, right? So there is an ongoing natural, ongoing existence of the state of nature, even within society. Okay, I'm going to skip over some of this stuff. Okay, yeah, monarchy at the beginning elective. I mean, you can figure that out. Yeah, and kings originally were generals, and he cites a lot of examples from the Israelites. If you want to feel for what the first treatise is like, look at it's section 108, 109, in there where he's doing a lot of setting a lot of biblical examples. So in 111, he begins to get at the problems of the state of nature, right? So he says, maybe there was a golden age, but when monarchs came to have distinct and separate interests from their people, this is the bottom of second column 741, men found it necessary to examine more carefully the original and rights of government and find out ways to restrain the exorbitancies and prevent the abuses of that power. So you have to look carefully at monarchy. And so, where did lawful monarchies come from? Sorry, just bear with me here. But yeah, then 115, right? Look what he says on 115. There are no examples so frequent in history, both sacred and profane, as those of men withdrawing themselves in their obedience from the jurisdiction they were born under and the family or community they were bred up in, and setting up new governments in other places. Or he doesn't say this, but it's certainly not infrequent that people set up a new government in the place where they are, right? They revolt. So you cannot bind your children because you owe allegiance to a particular government. You cannot bind your children to owe allegiance to that government. They are free. And this is the point in those last sections of on 742 and 743. Okay. So government. Well, what about inheritance? How does the son then come by his obligation? Well, if you inherit property or if you own property, right, you are subject to the law. So this is Locke's answer to sort of how implicit consent or tacit consent might be given. So when you agree to own a piece of property, when you agree to give a particular or to marry or something like that, right? To be bound by some legal framework, you're implicitly agreeing that you owe allegiance to that government. So voting and other kinds of more explicit political behavior includes that. So, but it takes agreement. It takes, he says at the end of chapter 8, right? Positive engagement, express promise, compact. You must agree, and you must be aware that you've agreed in order for government to bind you. So chapter 9, we finally cut to the chase, right? Why will he part with his freedom? Why government? Why do we need government? Right? This is the implicit question that Locke has been addressing all along. Well, he kind of gives Hobbes's answer here, right? Though in the state of nature he has such a right to govern himself, right to care for himself, yet the enjoyment of it is very uncertain. So you live in the state of nature, but it's precarious. And why? Because human beings, he says, the greater part of human beings are no strict observers of equity and justice. People are selfish. People are hostile. In some ways, this is a harsher version of in these sections, a harsher version of the state of nature even than Hobbes. So what do they do then? Well, or why do they run to government? Section 124. I mean, this is all the Lockean answer you need, probably. The great and chief end, therefore, of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. That's what government is for. Government is to protect property, period. End of story. Now you know. Now understand that the Supreme Court, for example, sees our government, our polity, in very Lockean terms, and sees their role as primarily helping to preserve property. So what are the deficiencies? Well, known, an established, settled, known law. In the state of nature, there lacks a known and indifferent judge. And in the state of nature, there is not power to back and support the sentence when right and give it due execution. So people are miserable in the state of nature. Hobbes is right about that. They're miserable in the state of nature because of these three defects, right? That's the problem with the state of nature. What powers do human beings have, right? To do whatever he thinks fit for the preservation of himself and others within the permission of the law of nature, this is section 128, and to punish the crime. So you have the executive power and you have the power of self-preservation. Those are your two powers. Now, Locke is not quite as emphatic as Hobbes is that those powers are totally given up in civil society, and we'll see why that's true. He says you give up your judgment about self-preservation by consenting to obey the laws. But, spoiler alert, you don't give it up totally. He says the power of punishing you totally give up, which is also not true, but it's mostly true. Because you decide how you are going to punish infractions of the law of nature. That is to say, how you are going to respond to attacks or qualifications on your self-interest. 746, it's not altogether clear where Locke draws this inference, but again, he's making the case for limited government, right? So government only has the power to go as far in certain ways as to do certain things. So government doesn't have the power over, right? Preservation of your property is the end of government, the purpose of government. And so government has no right to interfere with your use of your property in ways that you think appropriate. Moreover, as he tells us in section 131, this is on 746, the power of the society or legislative constituted by them can never be supposed to extend farther than the common good. Right? So what is the good of everyone? We still don't quite know how Locke is defining this, but whatever it is, that's the limit on government power. So next time we'll start by talking about different forms of commonwealth and the extent of legislative power. Maybe Locke will unfold for us a little bit what he means by the common good, but maybe not. You're going to have to stay tuned for that. Okay, thanks.